Hello, students. This is Mr. McNamara, and today we're going to be reading section 2 of chapter 9 called Government in Athens. So, if you would turn to that, um, what is it on page 262? Okay, I'm just going to read the main ideas and the big idea really quick. So, on the left hand side of your page, the main ideas are aristocrats and tyrants ruled early Athens. Number two, Athens created the world's first democracy. Three, ancient democracy was different than modern democracy. And the big idea is the people of Athens tried many different forms of government before creating a democracy. The key terms in people are democracy, aristocrats, oligarchy, citizens, tyrant, and Pericles. Okay, if you were there, for many years your city has been ruled by a small group of rich men. They have generally been good leaders. They have built new buildings and protected the city from enemies. But now a new leader wants to let all free men help run the government. It won't matter whether they are rich or poor. Some people, however, worry about giving power to ordinary people. What do you think of this new government? So, everything we've studied thus far pretty much has been governments run by emperors and kings. So now this is where we're going to start to see a shift in how people govern themselves. And so when we look back at where democracy came from, which is a government pretty much ruled by the people, we have to look at ancient Greece, and that's what this section is going to be about. Okay, oops. All right, building background. The decision to change a city's government was not unusual in Greece. Many cities tried several forms of government before people were satisfied. To see how these changes came about, we can look at one city whose government changed many times, Athens. Aristocrats and tyrants rule. Greece is the birthplace of democracy, a type of government in which people rule themselves. The word democracy comes from Greek words meaning rule the people. But Greek city states didn't start as democracies, and not all became democratic. Rule by a few people. Even Athens, the city where democracy was born, began with a different kind of government. In early Athens, kings ruled the city state. Later, a group of rich landowners, or aristocrats, took power. A government in which only a few people have power is called an oligarchy. The aristocrats dominated Athenian society. As the richest men in town, they ran the city's economy. They also served as its generals and judges. Common people had little say in government. In the 600s BC, a group of rebels tried to overthrow the aristocrats. They failed. Possibly as a result of their attempt, however, a man named Draco created a new set of laws for Athens. These laws were very harsh. For example, Draco's laws made minor crimes such as loitering punishable by death. So loitering, if you don't know what that is, it's kind of just hanging around with nothing to do. Sometimes you'll see, even probably in Brentwood, there'll be signs that say no loitering. So you can't just hang around on a street corner all day. The people of Athens thought Draco's laws were too strict. In the 590s BC, a man named Solon created a set of laws that were much less harsh and gave more rights to non aristocrats. Under Solon's laws, all free men in Athens became citizens, people who had the right to participate in government. But his efforts were not enough for the Athenians. They were ready to end the rule of aristocracy. The rise of the tyrants. Because the Athenians weren't pleased with the rule of the aristocrats, they wanted a new government. In 546 BC, a noble named Pisistratus overthrew the oligarchy. He became the ruler of Athens. Pisistratus was called a tyrant, which means a leader who held power through the use of force. Today, the word tyrant means a ruler who is harsh, but the word had a different meaning in ancient Greece. Athenian tyrants were usually good leaders. Tyrants were able to stay in power because they had strong armies and because the people supported them. Pisistratus brought peace and prosperity to the city. He began new policies meant to unify the city. He created new festivals and built temples and monuments. During his rule, many improvements were made in Athens. After Pisistratus died, his son took over as tyrant. Many aristocrats, however, were unhappy because their power was gone. Some of these aristocrats convinced a rival city state to attack Athens. As a result of this invasion, the tyrants lost power, and for a short time, aristocrats returned to power in Athens. And real quick, I'm going to scroll up here. So, government, it first started out ruled by kings, and that's called a monarchy. Okay, they don't say it here, but any society ruled by kings is called a monarchy or a queen. Then it switched to this thing called oligarchy. Okay, by a few powerful rich men. Okay, that's an oligarchy. Then it switched to what's called a tyranny, and that's with Pisistratus. Okay, usually like a general or someone in the military usually became the tyrant in charge. Many times during times of war, they wanted a tyrant to kind of tell them what to do. It says Pisistratus overthrew the oligarchy in 546 BC, and Athens became a tyranny. Tyranny means rule by a tyrant, a strong leader who has power. And then it went to here where it says democracy. Around 500 BC, Athens became a democracy. Democracy means rule by the people. For the first time in history, a government was based on the votes of its free citizens. Okay, we'll get to this history close up in just a minute, but let me just talk about Athens, how they created democracy. It says around 500 BC, a new leader named Cleisthenes gained power in Athens. Although he was a member of one of the most powerful families in Athens, Cleisthenes didn't want aristocrats to run the government. He thought they already had too much influence. By calling on the support of the people, Cleisthenes was able to overthrow the aristocracy once and for all. In its place, he established a completely new form of government. Under Cleisthenes' leadership, Athens developed the world's first democracy. For this reason, he is sometimes called the father of democracy. Democracy under Cleisthenes. Under Cleisthenes, all citizens in Athens had the right to participate in the assembly, or a gathering of citizens that created the city's laws. The assembly met outdoors on a hillside so that everyone could attend the meetings. During meetings, people stood before the crowd and gave speeches on political issues. Every citizen had the right to speak his opinion. In fact, the Athenians encouraged people to speak. They loved to hear speeches and debates. After the speeches were over, the assembly voted. Voting was usually done by a show of hands, but sometimes the Athenians used secret ballots. So let me just, before I move on. So this is says democracy in action. Ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy, the system of government in which the people rule themselves. Democracy was perhaps the greatest achievement of ancient Athens. In time, it became the Greeks' greatest gift to the world. But something to remember: only free male citizens of Athens were members of the assembly with the right to vote. Women, slaves, and foreigners could not participate. And here in the background, you see the Acropolis. Okay, that's the hill in the middle of the city state of Athens. And on top, you see a temple to Athena called the Parthenon, which is still it's still there today. It's being rebuilt because it's been destroyed several times. Okay, in Athenian democracy, people debated issues in the open air, and these debates were noisy affairs. They would do secret ballots. They would write their vote on these broken pieces of pottery. And then here's a continuation. It says the Athenian assembly met on a hill called a ponyx. Sometimes more than 6,000 men crowded onto the small hill. Men spoke before the assembly to support or argue against different issues. Persuasive speakers often convinced others to pass laws they supported. Men in the crowd often argued with the speakers. Okay, so this is why it's important to learn how to be a persuasive speaker, which you guys are probably working on now. Okay, the number of people who voted in the assembly changed from day to day. For major decisions, however, the assembly needed about 6,000 people to vote, but it wasn't always easy to gather that many people together in one place. According to one Greek, the government sent slaves to the market to round up more citizens if necessary. In one of the writer's plays, slaves walked through the market holding a long rope between them. The rope was covered in red dye and would mark the clothing of anyone it touched. Any citizen with red dye on his clothing had to go to the assembly meeting or pay a large fine. Because the assembly was so large, it was sometimes difficult to make decisions. The Athenians therefore selected citizens to be city officials and to serve on a smaller council. These officials decided which laws the assembly should discuss. This helped the government run more smoothly. Changes in Athenian democracy. As time passed, citizens gained more power. For example, they served on juries to decide court cases. Juries had anywhere from 200 to 6,000 people, although juries of about 500 people were much more common. Most juries had an odd number of members to prevent ties. Athens remained a democracy for about 170 years. It reached its height under a brilliant elected leader named Pericles. He led the government from 460 BC until his death in 429 BC. Pericles encouraged the Athenians to take pride in their city. He believed that participating in government was just as important as defending Athens in war. To encourage people to participate in government, Pericles began to pay people who served in public offices or on juries. Pericles also encouraged the people of Athens to introduce democracy into other parts of Greece. End of democracy in Athens. So democracy did eventually end, and you'll kind of see why. It says eventually the great age of Athenian democracy came to an end. In the mid 330s BC, Athens was conquered by the Macedonians from north of Greece. After the conquest, Athens fell under strong Macedonian influence. Even after being conquered by Macedonia, Athens kept its democratic government, but it was a democracy with very limited powers. The Macedonian king ruled his country like a dictator, a ruler who held all the power. No one could make any decisions without his approval. In Athens, the assembly still met to make laws, but had to be careful not to upset the king. The Athenians didn't dare make any drastic changes to their laws without the king's consent. They weren't happy with the situation, but they feared the king's powerful army. Before long, though, the Athenians lost even this limited democracy. In the 320s BC, a new king took over Greece and ended Athenian democracy forever. So, those of you who know a little history, the Macedonians at this time was King Philip. And King Philip had a son who you may have heard of. His name was Alexander the Great, and that's who they're referring to in that last sentence. Okay, ancient democracy differs from modern democracy. Like ancient Athens, the United States has a democratic government in which the people hold power, but our modern democracy is very different from the ancient Athenians' democracy. So here's going to talk about two different types. One is called direct democracy, and one is called representative democracy. Okay, direct democracy is what they used in Athens, where everybody gets one vote and its majority wins. That's not exactly how it works here in the United States, where we have representatives. We vote for representatives, and the representatives go to, say, Sacramento or to Washington, D.C., and they vote on laws. And that's how it works here. So it says direct democracy. All citizens in Athens could participate directly in the government. We call this form of government a direct democracy. It's called a direct democracy because each person's decision directly affects the outcome of a vote. In Athens, citizens gathered together to discuss issues and vote on them. Each person's vote counted and the majority ruled. The United States is too large for direct democracy to work for the whole country. For example, it would be impossible for all citizens to gather in one place for a debate. Instead, the founders of the United States set up another kind of democracy. Representative democracy. The democracy created by the founders of the United States is a representative democracy or a republic. In this system, the citizens elect officials to represent them in the government. These elected officials then meet to make the country's laws and to enforce them. For example, Americans elect senators and representatives to Congress, the body that makes the country's laws. Americans don't vote on each law that Congress passes, but trust their chosen representatives to vote for them. So here's a good T chart. It says democracy then and now. So way back when, in Athenian direct democracy, all citizens met as a group to debate and vote directly on every issue. In American representative democracy, however, it says citizens elect representatives to debate and vote on issues for them. Separation of powers in the middle here. It says there was no separation of powers. Citizens created laws, enforced laws, and acted as judges. So they kind of did everything. Everybody pitched in and did different jobs. They created them. They were also the police and they were also the judges. But here we have a separation of powers. Citizens elect some people to create laws. Then we have police officers to enforce the laws, and then we also elect judges separately. So it's not all done by the same. Like you don't get to be a policeman and a judge, okay? As in Athens, you might be able to do that. And the last little bullet says only free male citizens could vote. Women and slaves could not vote. So that's how it was back then. If you're a woman, didn't matter how smart you were, you did not get a chance to vote. Okay, in American representative democracy, men and women who are citizens have the right to vote. If you're not a citizen, you're not supposed to be voting in American elections. Okay, summary and preview. In this section, you learn about the development and the decline of democracy in Athens. You also learn how Athenian democracy influenced the government of the United States. In the next section, you will learn about the beliefs and culture of the ancient Greeks and how they affect our culture and literature today. Okay, thank you for listening, and you will probably have an Ed puzzle to complete.